Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live webcast. My name is Jane Cobb. I'm Executive Director of the SEC Historical Society. We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving and sharing the history of our public markets through our virtual museum at sechistorical.org. The program we're presenting today is part of a larger museum project, a gallery on the history of the PCAOB. It's being curated by Lucy Harvey and is scheduled to open in April of this spring. In today's program, we wanted to capture the opportunities and challenges that faced both the PCAOB and the audit profession in the early days of Sarbanes-Oxley Act implementation. In the first panel, we will hear from 4 of the 5 founding board members of the PCAOB. These are the folks who were responsible for standing up in a very short period of time a new regulatory entity charged with standard setting, inspections, and enforcement of US public company auditors. In the second panel, we will hear from representatives from the audit profession who were leading their firms through a significant transition to a new and more demanding regulatory regime. Our moderator for panel 1 is Gordon Seymour. Gordon worked at the PCAOB for 15 years, from 2003 to 2018. He started out as the organization's acting general counsel, then served as deputy general counsel and corporate secretary from November 2003 through February 2007. Gordon was named PCAOB's general counsel in February 2007 and served in that role until May 2018. Prior to his time at the PCAOB, Gordon spent almost 6 years at the SEC in a number of roles and also practiced at Williams & Connolly. He is now special counsel for public policy at Glass Lewis. Gordon, thank you very much for being our moderator today, and I'll turn the program over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jane. Before I begin, I want to say thanks to you, Lucy Harvey, and the SEC Historical Society for hosting this panel and all your work on the PCAOB Gallery. Based on what I've seen, I think it's going to be a great addition to the online museum. Today, we're going to hear from the 4 original board members who took the words of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and turned them into an actual regulatory organization. The decisions made by the founding board members during this period were critical and shaped what the PCAOB, with its 800-some employees, regional offices throughout the country, and global impact is today. It's also important to remember that what we're going to discuss today happened in the span of a year, and much of it in just a few months. To recap, Sarbanes-Oxley was signed in late July 2002. The SEC named the founding board members in late October, and they started informally meeting by November. The board opened its own offices in January of 2003, and all this happened with looming statutory deadlines. The SEC had to determine that the board was capable of carrying out its duties by April 2003, and the PCAOB had to register hundreds of US accounting firms by no later than October that year. Finally, I want to acknowledge the role of Bill McDonough, who passed away in 2018. Bill, of course, joined the PCAOB as its first permanent chair in June of 2003 and served in that role until December 2015. While he was not one of the original 4 board members, once he joined the organization, his gravitas and always eloquent and passionate support for the organization were critical to its early success. His chairmanship was a fitting capstone to his remarkable career in public service. Let me turn now to our 4 panelists. I want to begin by introducing each of them and inviting them to reflect on their experience standing up the board. Kayla Gillen served on the board from 2003 until 2008. Prior to her appointment, Kayla served as the general counsel of Kueppers, the largest public pension fund in the US and a preeminent voice on corporate governance. She held the role of general counsel for 6 years, and she worked at Kueppers for 16 years in total. During her career subsequent to her board service, she has also worked as deputy chief of staff and senior advisor to Chair Mary Shapiro at the SEC, as chief administrative officer of ISS Risk Metrics Group, and as a principal at PwC in quality assurance and investor liaison roles. In addition to being a lawyer, investor advocate, and corporate governance expert, Kayla brought the experience of having been a senior manager in a large organization and took the lead in the PCAOB's early days on corporate organizational issues, such as drafting bylaws and ethics code and setting up HR systems and processes. Kayla, what were your expectations coming in as an investor advocate, and as well as the only board member from outside the Beltway? And how did you bring those experiences and your perspective as an investor to bear as a founding board member?
Well, thanks, Gordon, very much for introducing us and leading us through our discussion today. And I too want to thank the SEC Historical Society for sort of getting the band back together again. It's been really good to see some of the people that I shared some of the most exciting / tense, anxiety-ridden times of my professional career. It was a great experience to have shared with you all. I had 3 goals. I'm not going to really call them expectations when I accepted the PCAOB appointment. And as you mentioned, moved my family across country from California to DC. The first, I knew that I had been appointed because a lot of investor advocates and activists had worked really hard to convince the SEC commissioners, and especially Chairman Pitt, that my experience and voice would help to restore investor confidence in the auditing profession, and through that in the capital markets as a whole. I think it's important to remember the times. Investors had truly been rocked by the Enron, Tyco, and WorldCom scandals. A lot of real people lost real money. For example, at CalPERS, we received more letters and phone calls from our retirees and their survivors who were very worried about their financial security than we ever had at any time in the past. So my first goal was to try to ensure that investors had an opportunity to see into and comment upon our decision-making processes. I wanted the question, how will this impact investor confidence, to be one of the at least second or third most important questions that we asked ourselves before making any significant decision. And secondly, since as you noted, I had spent much of the previous 16 years meeting with corporate directors of public companies, and all of those companies at the time I met with them were experiencing some form of poor performance. So I wanted to share with my colleagues some of my perspectives about what contributed to and negated from high-performing boards. Now, here's where I have to admit that I was probably naive. I now recognize how different the incentives, expectations, and accountability of corporate directors are as compared to PCAOB board members. But my colleagues were very kind and generous as we went through the push-pull of our own governance discussions. And for that, I will always be grateful. And the third, and I think this was a objective that when we all first met for the first time in those informal meetings in November, we all identified as a very important issue. We knew that as board members, we had term limits and that we had a narrow window within which to try to create a long-term organizational structure and culture that would hopefully help the PCAOB withstand the challenges that it would face, not only in the short term, but in the long term. So we spent quite a bit of time talking about employee demographics and skill sets. And I'm sure some of the other board members will comment on that. For example, we knew that we needed both senior auditors who had the gravitas to go toe-to-toe with senior firm professionals, and we needed people who were more junior in their careers, who had very recent auditing experience. How could we attract these people from the stability of their accounting firms to an organization that was at that point somewhat tenuous? We hadn't even been certified by the SEC, to be an ongoing enterprise. And then once we got past that threshold, a couple of years down the road, how would we continue to attract new incoming and recent auditing experience once our initial hires were further and further removed from that experience? This all depended, we thought, on an organizational credibility, which in turn depended both on the quality of the work we performed and the character of those people performing it. We knew we would be under a microscope. As I recall, the phrase glass house was used quite a bit. So I think our third objective, or my third objective, but a shared one certainly by all, was to try to create a culture that valued ethics and character and to build guardrails to foster this kind of culture as subsequent boards and staff came to be. Now, I think I have to leave it to others to judge how successful we were in that, but it certainly was a high priority for us. With that, I'm going to see if anyone else has any comments, or you can move on, Gordon.
Great. Thanks, Kayla. So let me turn next to Dan Gelser. Dan served on the board from 2003 until March 2012, and he was also acting chairman of the PCAOB from August 2009 through January 2011. Dan is both an accountant and a lawyer. Earlier in his career, he spent over 15 years on the SEC staff, including serving as SEC General Counsel from 1983 until 1990. He also spent over a decade as a partner at Baker & McKenzie, practicing corporate and securities law. Dan, if I'm not mistaken, remains the longest serving General Counsel in SEC history. Among other things, Dan serves today as a board member on the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. Dan's deep knowledge and experience in SEC practice were critical, given the parallels between the PCAOB's statutory functions and some of the SEC's regulatory programs, as well as their oversight role. In fact, Dan, I believe, had put pen to paper and started developing outlines for board programs and registration rules probably on the first day he was named a PCAOB board member. Dan, talk a little about the vision you brought for how the PCAOB should be structured and operate, and what it was like in those early days to work to put that into effect.
Hey, thanks, Gordon. And let me join Kayla in thanking the Historical Society for bringing this group together. I mean, it's really a treat to have the opportunity to talk about these events with four people. And I certainly include you, Gordon, who kind of lived the challenges of getting the PCAOB started. You asked what vision I brought for how the PCAOB would be structured and operated. I don't think I had anything as nearly as glorious as a vision when we first started out on this. And certainly a lot of the work done in the early stages was simply to put the basics in place of a functioning organization, get the SEC's approval to begin operations and to start running. And when we talk about the lists I drew up, I think it was pretty much just a matter of going through the statute, trying to think about what kind of rules we'd have to adopt or other steps we'd have to take in order to put flesh on the bones that Congress had laid out for us. But I guess to the extent I thought about it, I saw us as sort of a hybrid between a government agency and an SRO, hopefully with the best features of each. I mean, from the agency standpoint, like the SEC, we were a full-time board. The industry that we regulated had no say in our membership and no input directly, at least into our policy making. We simply had the mission of furthering the public interest in reliable financial reporting. On the other hand, like an SRO, we were a private organization. We didn't have to conform to things like the civil service laws and the Sunshine Act and the other things that can sometimes make it difficult to operate in government. So again, I kind of hope that we could have the best of both worlds, with freedom of a private organization and some of the rigor and public interest commitment of a government agency. In terms of structure, I guess having spent a lot of time at the SEC, I assumed we'd be structured like the SEC, and in particular with a chairman as CEO, head of management, board members that didn't specialize in particular areas or have oversight over particular parts of the organization. I guess from my SEC background, those things didn't seem controversial at the time, although I think they may have become controversial. Kayla perhaps alluded to some of the, I'll say, discussions we had over what the governance structure of the board should be. I also did feel that despite not being subject to the Sunshine Act and some of those other government procedural requirements, that we should be as transparent and public as possible, have public board meetings as frequently as possible, and a series of other things, roundtables and other opportunities for the public to have input and see what we were doing. I think the basics we put in place turned out to work pretty well. I think they've stood the test of time. But you also asked what it was like to be putting the PCAOB into operation. I guess I'd say first it was a great privilege and really a lot of fun to be part of creating a new regulatory body. There are very few people that can say that they lived through that sort of experience. But there were also a lot of challenges. And I guess four things stood out to me. First, we started with absolutely nothing. There were just 5 board members, and then there were 4 board members after Bill Webster resigned, but we had no offices, no staff, no telephones, nothing. I can still remember Bill Gradison and I walking around downtown Washington looking at vacant office space for the board's offices and hitting on the space that Arthur Anderson had recently vacated. But that was certainly a challenge. I think the first day that the doors opened, there were maybe 6, 8 of us on the payroll, something like that. The second, and Kayla alluded to this, I felt like we were operating very much in I'll say a fishbowl. There was an amazing amount of, I thought, public attention to the creation of the board in its early days, maybe even in a way out of proportion to what we actually were. I think when we had that first organizational meeting at Baker and McKenzie's offices, I'm told that there were press in the elevator lobby to, I don't know if they tried to interview you all as you came in or take pictures of you or something. I know C-SPAN was there for one of our early public meetings. I don't think they broadcast it live. And I think after they heard the content, they ended up running it at like 2 a.m. in the morning or something on a Sunday. There was just a lot of news coverage of what we were doing. Third, and maybe most importantly, I felt that we were operating in a world where there was a sense among a lot of people that we wouldn't succeed, maybe even a presumption that we wouldn't succeed. There were the unfortunate events surrounding Bill Webster's resignation and the turmoil that caused at the SEC. And I think there's sort of a general perception that we'd be either ineffectual or captives of the industry. And that certainly influenced a lot of things that happened early on. Certainly one of the first decisions we made was that we had to conduct inspections of some sort during our first year of operation in order to establish credibility. I think that was a very important decision. I think either explicitly or implicitly, we decided that while we certainly needed people from the profession for the staff, people with experience, recent experience in public accounting and auditing, we really couldn't have this senior staff directly from the profession, that we might pay a price in terms of credibility for that. And another challenge was whether the registration system would work. We know we had to create a registration system. We wanted to build our own. We wanted it to be automated, but it was really touch and go whether that would end up succeeding. And I guess the final thing I think of from those days, I think Kayla alluded to this as well, and I know it's something that Bill's likely to mention, is after we began to hire staff, I think there was a real sense of camaraderie and mission. We picked up a lot of people who had been in public accounting and really felt a personal commitment to trying to restore the profession's reputation from the scandals of the late 1990s and early 2000s. And it was that sense of sort of shared mission and camaraderie was really maybe the most valuable thing that I remember, the thing I take the most satisfaction from those days. So it's interesting to see what's happened to the PCAOB over the years it's been in existence. Well, when I left 9 years later, I think there were about 800 people on the staff, 850, something like that. And that's something that I wouldn't have imagined on that first day. But those are kind of my recollections of what it was like to get the PCAOB going.
Great, thanks, Dan. Next on our panel is Bill Gradison. Bill served on the board from 2003 until 2011, including serving as acting chair from December 2005 to July 2006. Prior to his appointment to the board, Bill served 9 terms as a member of Congress representing his home state of Ohio, and serving for 8 of those years as ranking member on the House Budget Committee and the Health Subcommittee of the Committee on Ways and Means. During his long and distinguished career, Bill has also been on the faculty of the Harvard Business School, served as mayor of Cincinnati, and worked as an investment banker at a prominent DC law firm. Bill was the de facto Congressional Relations Office before that office existed at PCAOB, and he is also serves as a champion for and a liaison to the academic community, something still reflected today in the PCAOB's strong ties to many of the larger university accounting programs. Bill, before being named to the board, you had spent most of your 5-decade career in public service and in fact elective office. How did that experience shape how you approach your role as a founding board member? And how was your experience starting up the PCAOB similar or different from your prior public service?
Thanks, Gordon. And by the way, thanks for all you did to help us get started. You made an enormously positive, had amazing impact on it during those early days. You've understandably focused on my checkered career in elective and appointive office, but actually what led to my interest in serving on the PCAOB board was an earlier life. I spent almost 20 years with a Cincinnati-based New York Stock Exchange firm, mainly working with individuals. So my focus, although frankly, I don't remember ever saying it this way to my colleagues, was on the individuals. It was at a time when people tended to buy individual stocks rather than mutual funds were around, but they weren't anything like they are today. Having been in the business, I realized how important data was, accurate data, let's put it that way, in analyzing financial statements. But I also realized the value of audits to our own firm. And this may sound strange, but I look forward to the arrival of our auditors each year. At that time was Haskins and Sells, which I think later became part of Deloitte. We really worked hard at having a strong back office, maybe because the founder of our firm started as a board marker and messenger before he even became a bookkeeper. And this may sound corny, but his motto is, we don't go home at night until the books are in order. And we live it that way. We saw what could happen when one of our major Cincinnati competitors at a time of heightened market activity lost control and went out of business. So this was more than just a matter of academic interest to us and to me. I did get involved for quite a while in a 9-member city council, and then later the 435-member House of Representatives. And it was quite a shock to move to having individual constituents, my customers, to having 500,000, literally 500,000, which really meant I was my own boss. So that's really how it works it out that way. In public office, I was able to join committees which Gordon mentioned, or which are relevant to what we're talking about today. Once Sarbanes-Oxley came along, but which, by the way, as an aside, was a lot more Sarbanes than Oxley. And I know what actually happened, it sounds kind of quaint today, but it was approved almost unanimously by the Congress. Things like that once happened. But I was intrigued by the mission of the PCAOB. It seemed to fit in with what I had been interested in over the years. And it also, at my age then, I thought it might be a perfect last full-time job, which is exactly how it worked out. So what did I do? I called Mike Oxley and I told him I was interested. I didn't hear anything for quite a while. Then I was asked to come down to the SEC for an interview. I didn't even know where the SEC was. I got in a cab and asked the cabbie to take me to the SEC. PCAOB, to focus on what I was asked to talk about, was very different from where I worked before. It was small. By the time we were approved in April, maybe a dozen of us, something like that. It was new, very different from the work I had done in the government as an assistant to cabinet officers at the Treasury and the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, now HHS. And of course, it was not subject, as Dan has mentioned, to the rules that apply to federal departments. We picked a search firm. We did the interviewing. We made the selection. We set the salaries. We didn't have anything to do with the Office of Personnel Management. And the same thing was true with regard to space. We did not go through the GSA. But I think one of the most important things that went on in those early months, unlike a lot of other places, we did not have a permanent chairman. And I think this shaped a lot in the way in which we worked together during those days. Frankly, we couldn't wait to have a permanent chairman because we had that April deadline hanging over our heads, and we didn't know when the permanent chairman would be selected or would get started with us. Yes, we met initially in Dan's office. A very hard place to work because of the view. It's the best view in Washington, and I've worked out there off and on for almost 70 years. But we did meet regularly, sometimes with outside groups, which was extremely helpful at that early stage. And once we got started in our to be our permanent Washington office, we would daily, the four of us, meet around an old table, one of the few pieces of furniture left behind after the Anderson furniture was sold. We divided up the work at hand. We reported back the next morning or the day as soon as we had information about the things which we were working on. And the same thing was true with deciding on the organization chart, identifying the specific senior positions, and meeting with those candidates. And as I recall it, if after an interview, any one of us raised even an eyebrow, we'd do a little bit more interviewing of other candidates. It was that kind of relationship. It was a lot of fun back in those days. Once we moved into our permanent office, as I recall it, we wondered why we had no mail. It turned out the post office didn't know we were there. And so the first delivery was probably a foot high, maybe higher. Oh, and we also had no telephones, as was mentioned before. Verizon, always helpful, of course, said they could hook us up in about 2 weeks. Well, we shared that information with our space consultant. We were hooked up overnight with a company I had never heard of. Maybe the others had. XO Communications, I think, was their name. Dan and I were designated to work on space. We did tour in Washington, and Charlie, the bravest of us all, assigned the lease at a time we had no bank account at all. I then was asked to take on New York and made the rounds up there. Interesting, our first issue in New York, very simply, was where we wanted to be, Midtown, downtown, or New Jersey. Downtown, this was soon after 9/11, as you may recall. Downtown in New Jersey, rents were lower. We chose Midtown because so many of the big firms had their offices there. And we felt, and it turned out to be correct, that this would assist us in recruitment because somebody who came with us from one of those firms didn't have to change their commuting time. I happened to be at Dallas at one point, and they were interviewing inspection candidates. And I said, I'm always glad to meet with people. I had no role in the selection, but they might have questions for a board member. At the end of a long interview with a really nice young guy, I said, well, if you join us, what will it do to your commuting? Smile from ear to ear. He said, it will cut an hour off my commuting time every day. And so things like that do tie together, even though we pay a little bit more for rent, maybe a lot more for rent. The New York was a little different. We were very lucky to run into a property as a sublet. It was a tech company that had gone belly up in that period. The desks were there. The file cabinets were there, never used, and they had even built in a training room, adequate just for about 20 people, as I recall it, which was just perfect in meeting our needs. My special interest, and this is the last thing I really want to talk about, were first of all congressional outreach, which was already mentioned. I accompanied our chairs for all our House visits, which was a big undertaking because there were about 100 offices up there, 100 members who were either on one of the committees of jurisdiction in the House or Senate, or in the leadership. I tell them about what we did, ask if they've been hearing much about it. A few of them did because that was during the AS2 period. And then our chairman said he'd look into any complaints, but I offered to go to any district or state if any of those members wanted me to meet with their business people, if there are problems or issues. I was never taken up on that offer, which I felt pretty good about, actually. I was on the plane enough as it was. Second activity was to meet with accounting students. I really loved doing that. And I wasn't the only one of us that did, but in thinking about today, I made a note purely from memory. I did this in Delaware, North Carolina, Ohio, Utah, Tennessee, Texas, Charlie, Michigan, and Virginia, and I may have missed a few. I really enjoyed it, and they were happy to have a free speaker who paid his own travel. And then, of course, there was our trip. We all went up, I think, to Harvard Business School, as I recall it, and which was a big deal for me because it was the first time since I had left that campus to go to the Treasury in 1953. And the final thing, I really liked and responded to requests from people who ran our regional office to come out and visit, meet with staffs. And in particular, I went with George Diacon to every one of our offices during the rollout of AS5. I kid about this, but I think during that period, if I'd wake up at night, this voice would reverberate through my head. Materiality, 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 because that's what our inspection teams were hearing about all day long. And just to sum it all up for me personally, going out, getting out of the office, meeting particularly with our own staffs and times with those we regulated by going to I think I went to all the meetings we had for small firms, for example. It was a good feeling. It reminded me of my days going to town meetings. Personally, when I left, I had a good feeling. Maybe that's because I got reappointed. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Last but not least, we're going to hear from Charlie Niemeier. Charlie served on the board from 2003 until 2011, including serving as acting chair from January to June 2003, the initial period we're focused on today. At the time of his appointment, Charlie was the chief accountant of the SEC's Division of Enforcement and co-chair of the SEC's Financial Fraud Task Force. A lawyer as well as an accountant, Charlie has had a long and distinguished career as a partner in the Washington, D.C. law firm of Williams & Connolly, both before and after his public service. Charlie, as acting chair during the startup period, you wore a lot of hats. You presided over board meetings, you were the de facto chief recruiter, and as Bill referred to, you even signed the board's initial lease before there was funding to back up the payments for that. Having been at the SEC, you were also closest to a lot of the most significant issues in audit regulation at that time, including how the PCB inspections would differ from the POB's oversight of the peer review program. Tell us a little about what it was like to make that transition from the SEC to being the acting chair of the PCAOB.
Well, thank you, Gordon. And I also want to thank the SEC Historical Society for this really wonderful opportunity to reunite with my colleagues at the board and fellow board members, and even to be able to the panel that's going to follow, to see again all of the main leaders of the firms at that time. It's really a joy to be a part of this. One of the interesting things about the transition for me was that we had, at the SEC, were really deep into the investigations. I'm not sure there's ever been a time at the SEC where there was more financial fraud investigations underway at one time. I think we had 300 plus ongoing while I was there. And it has something that I was doing prior to even going to the SEC. I was doing a lot of investigative work. I really think that Sarbanes-Oxley was important and able to reestablish credibility in the marketplace, but it did focus primarily on the audit profession. In that regard, I wasn't sure that it actually was as broad as I would have liked it. And I think we found that, later in the 2007, 8, 9 time period, the financial crisis, the issues that didn't get addressed outside of the profession did manifest themselves into being an issue. But focusing on that particular time period, one of the things that I found in the investigations is that I never found an auditor that ever intended to perpetuate a fraud. I found often very good people, sometimes very good professionals who found themselves in a very difficult place and maybe made a bad decision. But I think a lot of it had to do with poor risk management. The whole system. It was enough blame to go around. It wasn't just the profession. It was the whole system had actually gone off course, where there were things that were being done that were considered to be okay because they were technically compliant, but yet they created a tremendous amount of risk in the system. And we saw that not just with small companies, but with large companies, obviously. By the time Sarbanes-Oxley was passed and we were then created, the PCAOB was created, it wasn't really us and them. It wasn't the PCAOB and it wasn't the profession. We were working together, in my mind, to address these issues. The profession, it was a wake-up call. I mean, to have a company like Arthur Andersen, a firm like Arthur Andersen go under because of an accounting scandal was a wake-up call for everyone, whether you were in the profession or outside of it. But certainly it changed the way there was a focus on risk. So, that's the background coming in. From the standpoint of actually being at the PCAOB, I think, my fellow board members have touched on this. There was a practical issue of actually just getting set up. And we had to hire people. We had to hire the right people. We had, because of the need to have the determination completed by April 25th, we needed to basically jump off the cliff and build a parachute at the same time. And there were decisions to be made. It wasn't just following the statute. We had to make decisions, and we had to find the right people to do it. And certainly, Gordon, we stole you from the SEC. You, the key person who walked the whole statute through Congress and knew it better probably than anyone else at the SEC. I don't think Giovanni would talk to me for a year after we stole you away. Giovanni Prezioso was the general counsel at the time at the SEC. And as others have said, we had to hire people who had credibility, but at the same time, we needed to have people who were very knowledgeable. And we were very, very fortunate to have people join us as much as anything on a leap of faith that it was going to work. I think it is true that there was a lot of people believed that we would not be successful, that we were not capable of actually putting things together in a workable form. And we didn't want to just make decisions. We wanted to make decisions that would be lasting. And there were a number of those that we had to deal with. There was a lot of pressure on us to allow the accounting profession to continue to write the auditing standards. To me, it was a practical issue that it didn't make sense to do that, in part because not only did we have to approve the rules, but they had to be the standards, but they had to be approved by the SEC. To have the profession do it, it would just add another layer. There'd be a 3-step process that would just be too difficult. With inspections, as I already mentioned, we wanted to start right away. It was really tremendous cooperation with the profession. The 4 firms stepped up, they cooperated. It was difficult, I'm sure, to have someone come in and be your overseer, but nonetheless, they stepped up. They did made it all possible for us at a time before they even had registered with us to get ready for inspections and be able to do that through the first year. We did want to have an online system. We stole Ray Schmidt from MicroStrategy. I think he never got credit for what he did during that time period, because not only did he give us an online registration system, which was not a small feat in a very short amount of time period, but he also helped us create our way of being funded, which not only funded us, but funded FASB. And this was not a simple calculation that had to be done. And, of course, we all know about the whiteboard that we had, that every day we had the countdown. How many days do we have left? And basically it was nothing more than just simply, we know how much time we need. We reverse engineered it, and we know what we had to do each day in order to accomplish that. And I think you want to echo those statements that it really, looking back on the camaraderie, is really what most important thing. I think we knew we needed to work together. We had to find a way to work through all these things. Whether we agreed on everything, we found a way to agree. We found a way to reach consensus because we needed to. And that to me is great credit to people who were dedicated to making something that would last. We, can't speak enough to the people that we brought in. George Dicont, very important, and all the people he brought in with him. And we brought, maybe forced upon him a little bit. People like Phil Wiedemeyer, Patty Thompson, of course, registrations. Chris Mandelaries. There's so many people, and I just can't mention them all here. It's too short a time, but there were so many people that really put us on the map and made that work. And I do think that when we, the things that happened later is part of what made us realize that we stood up, had something that was going to last, because it did grow. It did expand to, many more people throughout the country be able to conduct inspections. We had a lot of pressure on us we had discretion to not actually inspect audit firms outside the United States. That was built into the statute. We had discretion, as well as did the SEC, and we made the decision to do that. That was one of the more difficult ones, but it was very important for us to make that decision. And I think as far as, Claudius came in and helped us establish enforcement, it was sort of the tail wagging the dog, because we were not enforcement driven the way the SEC is. It was really inspections driven. The most important part of this for me was actually something that I learned from being at the SEC and doing investigations for years. And that is, often through the audit process, risk is identified, but it may not be recognized as being as high risk as it really is. We, for the first time ever, was going to be able to see the risk through the inspections of the audits across the whole system. And we could put that together in a database and then be able to help the profession and help the system by identifying risk before they actually manifest themselves into being a major problem. And that what led to the Office of Research and Analysis, which to me, although it wasn't in the statute, may be the most important thing that the PCAOB could do and has done in being able to, and I do think today it's still one of the best predictors of when there can be problems in the system. I don't know much about how it's being used today, but it did change, because even the firms themselves can see the audits that they're doing, but they can't see across the whole system. They can't see everything the way the PCAOB can. So to me, that's a major part of what we were doing. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks, Charlie. And by the way, Lucy Harvey claims that you stole your whiteboard countdown to the determination from McCormick and Schmick's countdown to St. Patrick's Day. So we'll let you respond to that later. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what Lucy said. So
I'm happy to give that credit. I'm sure we stole everything. We stole, we begged, we borrowed, we did everything we could during that time period. So I'm sure there's many more people we should give credit to.
Great. Now I want to turn to some of the key issues the board confronted during this time period. Maybe the most fundamental issue, and Charlie touched on this a little bit, was how the board should understand its relationship to the audit profession. Obviously, the PCAOB was established to regulate the audit profession, but how to approach that regulation was really left up to the board. Should the board lean heavily on enforcement and tougher standards to rein in a profession that abused the public trust, or should it see itself more as a partner, helping the profession restore its integrity through inspections, best practices, and other less confrontational measures? Kayla, how did you think about that issue?
Well, I think this, as the others were talking, I was just remembering that this question, it was such a fundamental part of even that first preliminary informal meeting we had, where, as I recall, Charlie really introduced me to the notion of competing models, the so-called enforcement model versus the so-called supervisory model. And we talked a lot about it. I think that we might have different recollections, so I'm anxious to hear what other people think. My recollection is that during those initial months, the January through April, when we got SEC blessing, and then June, when we ultimately, when Chairman McDonough was appointed, we were trying to, as Dan mentioned, have the best of both worlds. I think we were trying to come somewhere in the middle. On the one hand, we were hearing from investors who were very vocal with us doing all of our initial conversations that they really expected a meaningful and strong enforcement model from us. In their minds, the principal difference between self-regulation, which existed before, and then the creation of the PCAOB was this enforcement mindset. They wanted firms and partners that failed to comply with standards to be named and shamed, financially penalized, and potentially expelled from the portfolio. On the other hand, the existence of a strong and viable accounting profession and auditing profession that had already suffered the demise of Arthur Andersen was also critical to the confidence that all market participants had in audited financials. As I recall, both the SEC staff that we were working with and the members of the profession who were, as Charlie mentioned, were very generous to us and open and willing to work with us, we're obviously strongly supporting the more supervisory model. And I will say that there were a lot of investor advocates, definitely not all of them, that recommended or that recognized the tension between these two models and were encouraging us to try to find some sort of a hybrid approach. Now, this is kind of where my recollection might differ from my bandmates. As I recall, when Chairman McDonough was appointed, the scale tipped decidedly towards supervisory. When you consider his long experience at the Fed and some of the people that he brought in to assist him, they were bringing a perspective that having our inspectors have almost a constant presence within the firms, to work within the firms and in a non-public way help identify issues would be less disruptive and more effective overall and only reserving the enforcement tools to sort of the most egregious circumstances. And I think that's, chairmen have some prerogatives, and we were all trying to find the right consensus. And that's my recollection of how we sort of settled on a model that I think leans much more on the supervisory end of the scale, but I am anxious to hear what others remember.
Well, it is unfortunate that Bill McDonough can't be with us to kind of speak for himself on his views. And if you were here, I'm sure he'd get us all rapidly in line. But I think the only thing I'd add is I think I drew more of a distinction between this, what I'd call the supervisory model and the regulatory model. The board is criticized sometimes for not using enforcement more to address inspection findings. And I think I really feel that the system would collapse if most inspection findings were turned into enforcement actions, either because the firms would be forced to fight the inspection process tooth and nail to avoid the enforcement, or enforcement actions begin to look like parking tickets. Everybody had so many of them that it didn't mean anything. So I think I'd describe the model as a regulatory model in which the inspection process is I think is fairly critical on the firms, and certainly doesn't overlook standards violations that it detects, and then the firms have an incentive to improve their quality through the remediation process. And I think that's actually worked pretty well, and I think worked better than a more heavily weighted enforcement process would have.
Yeah, I'll just say that, look, I came out of enforcement at the SEC, obviously. I certainly was not against enforcement, but I did believe that the major value that the PCAOB was bringing to the system overall was on the inspection side, which was dependent upon the cooperation of the participants in the profession. And I also did not believe that the major problem at that time even was technical compliance with the auditing standards. I thought it was something broader than that, and I thought it was more difficult to address in an inspection. I thought it was easier to address in an inspection context than it was in an enforcement context, the type of issues that needed to be addressed, which had more to do with the broader issue of the business context. And which is often very difficult to deal with in enforcement. So I think it ended up in a good place. I'm very happy to where it ended up. And there obviously is an enforcement group, it's there. And I think the biggest problem with enforcement at the PCAOB today is simply the lack of transparency with that process, which continues to plague it and used to be a problem at the SEC until they fixed it. But even if that changed, it's still an inspection program based, which really to me is more about supervisory. And to Dan's point, whether it's regulatory or supervisory, it's less important to me. But I think we ended up in a good place.
I'll say, if I may, very quickly, that I think that we would have been a lot better off if we had been permitted under the statute to provide a lot more information than could be provided about what we had found in these inspections. I think some of you have alluded to that as well. More specifically, I want to say what about broker-dealers, because that's where I came from. The statutory provision about inspecting broker-dealers, I think, was a drafting error. And the SEC kept putting it off until Bernie Madoff changed everybody's minds. There was no question in my mind that there was a huge problem there. And it was complicated by the fact that you didn't have a big universe of skilled people to hire from, because it's a very specialized, even the terminology, failed to deliver, and mark to market are things that maybe not every CPA is using in their daily work. Finally, I want to say that there are two things very unusual about our situation, and only time will tell how that works out. The first is most of the employees that we brought on were the inspectors are from the people we were inspecting. I don't know of another example of that in an independent agency. And the other thing is 2 of our 5 board members are required to be CPAs. That could be problematic in the long run. There's a long history in the United States of regulatory capture. It certainly didn't happen while we were there. I have no reason to think it's happened since, but it could. And I think there are some things in the original writing of the bill which would suggest to me that wouldn't be a bad idea for him to take another look at it.
Thanks. Another major issue at the time, of course, was Section 404. I remember the SEC chief accountant at the time, Don Nicolaisen, describing that section as the biggest change to the scope of audits since the 1930s. Congress, not the board, had decided that all public companies should get an internal controls audit, but it was up to this board at a time when there was no established standard setting process and just a handful of staff to write the standard for how those audits would be done. And of course, all of you continued to serve on the board that later amended that initial standard. Dan, how did the new board approach its standard setting responsibilities and the internal control standard? And having been involved in both AS2 and AS5, what are your reflections on how it played out over time?
Well, in terms of general approach to standard setting, I mean, Charlie's alluded to some of this already. The statute gave us a choice as to whether we would set auditing standards directly ourselves or delegate that to a private sector body. I felt that was one of the easier decisions that we had to make early on. I don't think there was ever really serious consideration of delegating. And Charlie's mentioned a practical reason. They had sort of another step to the process before it got to SEC approval. And I saw it as one of those credibility issues, just in terms of establishing ourselves as separate from the profession and not its captive. I thought we just had to do the standard setting ourselves. I think we also had a thought at that time that we could marry the inspection process and the standard setting process and use information that we got from inspections to inform standard setting. I still think there's something to that, but I'm not sure we were ever really able to fully implement that vision. The other side of the coin, of course, is Bill's mentioned having 2 CPAs on the board. I won't speak at all for Charlie, who had a fair amount of experience in the profession, but as the other CPA, I certainly did not have the expertise to really engage in meaningful technical standard setting. So we had to fill that hole by creating a staff, or hiring a staff with expertise in auditing standards. And I think we're fortunate to be successful in doing that early on, particularly with Doug Carmichael as the first chief auditor and Tom Ray as his deputy. We also, that also led us to form the Standing Advisory Group, which I actually think was one of the best things that we did, not so much because they gave us technical input on standard setting, but because it created a public forum for a lot of different groups, constituencies with interest in the PCAOB to speak publicly with the board and have input and a stake in our processes. I mean, the other thing I would say about the general approach is that I think we all envisioned, and this is reflected in the releases, that while we had to adopt the existing standards as our interim standards, that we would rapidly go through all of the auditing standards and amend or revise them or ratify them and accept them. I think we radically underestimated the scope of that job. And while over time there have been a fair amount of amendments to what were the existing standards back in 2003, that process never really came to fruition. You've asked about 404. I've used up all my time, I think, without getting to it. We could talk for hours about 404 and AS2 and AS5. When the gallery comes out, there's an essay on those events, aptly entitled "A Political Hotbed," and I hope people will read that essay to get that story. I think others probably have comments. I think I just say, I think I at least underestimated what a task it would be for the profession to implement, in essence, a new auditing standard calling for a new audit. But I think this ended up being one of our greatest successes. The transformation from AS2 to AS5 didn't really, I think, change the substance or the rigor of the audit that we envisioned of internal controls. And I think today, financial reporting in the United States is stronger because of the internal control audit. And I think you can see that by comparing what's happened in our country with some of the scandals that have occurred outside the US in financial reporting in countries where they don't have an internal control requirement and an internal control audit. So I'll stop there.
One of the things about AS2 that, in my opinion, is that the Congress assumed a competence and experience in auditing internal controls over financial reporting, which didn't exist. And the reason I think that happened was because there was a requirement along those lines in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and that's where they got the language. And it turned out that that wasn't the case. So I think we all, I don't mean everybody, but I think in general, there was a sort of a starting from scratch and putting that together. I will say that I was tremendously impressed at the time by the process. Maybe there's no precedent for this or nothing like it since. Our board met publicly, sitting at the SEC with the SEC board in a big, maybe call the crowd, big public gathering just to talk about this. And then Bill McDonough took us aside in the back of the room. And then after touching base with us, publicly said that day right there that we were going to revise that. Personally, I thought that was of extreme importance because this thing could have gotten out of hand otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, just on your first point, I think there's no question that the audit requirement exposed a lot of what I think in those days was politely called deferred maintenance in terms of internal controls at companies themselves. And correcting that was a big component of the sort of the rough start in the first few years.
Yeah, I have to say, if we had our ruthers, I would not have actually started with 404. It's just the statute required us to do it. And I can't say that I can't take credit for anything out of that turned out good, other than to say that I think it turned out being brilliant, the way it worked out. To come out with AS2 as being the hard charging, this is changing everything kind of standard. And then AS5, which was more about, at least in my mind, marketing than it was change in substance, as Dan said. It turned out to be a very good move. And I do think that the result is that you had really within companies were using AS2 and AS5 to revamp their whole accounting systems. it may have cost a lot more than it should have, but it turned out to be a really important part of building a foundation for good financial reporting in the system. And I do think that it served well what it was intended to do. Again, all's well that ends well.
Maybe we should say for the record that was our plan all along, to go from AS2 to AS5.
I remember the charge that some companies were being told they had to have internal controls over financial reporting for petty cash. Or remember there was a one where they said 10,000 internal controls were required for GE or whoever it was. I mean, there was a lot of loose talk back in those days.
Well, I hate to pile on, but my personal epiphany was when the air conditioner repairman told me that he couldn't repair my air conditioning because it would violate internal controls.
Yes, Sarbanes-Oxley covered a lot in those times. Yeah. Let me, in the interest of moving on, I want to get to two more topics too. We could talk about 404 all day, I'm sure, but another issue not answered by the Act was how to staff the organization and what its culture should be. The PCAOB, as somebody alluded to earlier, a private sector entity with a public mission. Should it think of itself more as a private company or as a government entity? Should it staff up with accountants or with the lawyers and compliance professionals who staff the examination programs of the SEC and bank regulators? Bill, in a 2010 article you co-authored with Ron Boster, you wrote that because the PCAOB was a startup entity without organizational precedent, the initial board had the opportunity to establish a distinctive culture. Bill, talk a little more about what you meant by that and how the board's staffing and culture developed in those early days.
I wish I knew more about what happened after we left, frankly, along these lines. But I do think that we, first of all, had something which I believe is unique, and that perhaps I mentioned it earlier today, and that is most of the people we hired were from the organizations we were regulating. I'm not aware of a regulatory agency in Washington that general comment would apply to. Where else were we going to look for this experience? This in itself is potentially a challenge, but I was thinking of culture more of the board. My sense was that there was from the very beginning a situation where we worked very closely together. We had some disagreements, but we worked them out, and we divided up the tasks, and then we did have a permanent chairman come in. I can't speak for anybody else, but my view was that regardless of who the permanent chairman was, that as a board member, that I wasn't going to change the way I thought about things. For example, God forbid, from a chairman's point of view, that I as a board member should want to meet individually with department heads without having the chairman or the chief of staff sit in on it. I don't play that game. And I'm just saying, and I'm not trying to make a point except to say that there were some things that I personally felt came out of the way we got started that made us a little different from other organizations. In terms of private, public, we're mixed in a sense, but I think of us more as a public regulatory agency that was sufficiently, that almost had to have the leeway we had on hiring and on salaries and stuff like that in order to carry out our job. I personally thought, and I'm glad that we're not together, you might throw something at me if I say this, I think that the salary issue in the statute was a mistake. It tied us to the Auditing Standards Board. I got that. Good idea. The only trouble was it ended up that all of us were earning more than anybody at the SEC by a multiple. And maybe I was imagining things that didn't happen, but my sense was that put us in a very awkward, I thought, in a very awkward position, that they were the ones who appointed us, as it turned out, with thanks to the Supreme Court, could call up in the morning and tell us to pack our bags. And yet we were earning way more than they ever imagined. So small point perhaps, but I think it didn't help. Boy, that quieted everybody.
Anyone want to respond, or we discovered a topic that's going to?
Well, I actually agree with Bill. And I also think that to some extent, the salary structure inhibited, not just of the board, but of all of the staff, inhibited what I think we initially envisioned as a sort of a young auditors would come work for a few years and then go back to the firms and spread the PCAOB mission and you know, just sort of a more of a flow. And I'm not sure that our benefit and salary structure promoted that the way we had initially envisioned it.
I don't have a problem necessarily with the salary structure, but I do think to what points have already been made, that as far as board members, I saw it and I see it today even as a potential weakness to the extent that it may attract people that may not have the mission in mind. I'm not saying anything bad about current, you know, PCAOB or anything like that. I'm just saying that to me was a weakness. And it's one reason why I always felt like as a board member, part of my goal was to become redundant, that it was really to have the right people in the staff positions who could run the place without the board, because I thought the board had the potential to be the weak link in the whole system.
Yeah, I agree with what's been said. I don't think I can add much. I wouldn't go so far as to say the salary structure is a mistake, but it does have pros and cons. I think we needed those salaries to attract talent, but I do wish there was sort of more turnover, generally speaking, that people didn't have such an incentive to stay.
And you know, really, let's face it, it's a two-way street. We'd hire from the firms over time began to hire from us at senior positions. And I thought personally, as I've thought about it, pros and cons, I think that's a good thing over time in terms of getting a better understanding in both directions about how to work together. But it is not without risk, as we can see in one recent instance, which, if I've read the press correctly, involved that procedure creating a leak in terms of which engagements were going to be examined in one particular firm in one particular year. So there are two sides to these things.
Okay, let me jump in and see if I can put one more issue on the table in our remaining time. So maybe the most controversial policy issue the board faced in its first few months was the extraterritorial reach of its programs. In Sarbanes-Oxley, Congress had said that all accounting firms involved in audits of US traded companies should be held to the same standards. At the same time, it also gave the board exemptive authority for non-US accounting firms, leading to calls from some of those foreign firms to be exempted and not have to register with the PCAOB. How the founding board members dealt with that issue has had enormous ramifications to this day. Charlie, as acting chair, you were on the front lines of the battle over foreign registration. Tell us a little about that and your reflections on the board's decision some 20 years later.
Right. Well, thank you, Gordon. I do think we all faced that challenge. I'm not sure that I felt more of the pressure, but I was lobbied a lot. But I would imagine my fellow board members were as well. The principal arguments were that, you know, we were basically this very fledgling group who could barely hold it together anyway, and therefore you're going to be lucky to be able to do inspections of the U.S. firms in the United States. So don't expand their territory to be the world. The problem for me is that I had a pretty good idea of how the system is set up, and the United States is unique in the world. Because it has multinational companies that operate throughout the world and rely upon audits that are performed throughout the world. At the same time, there is a lot of foreign private issuers that were accessing the US markets. All of this means that to leave out the audits performed outside the United States means that the US investor was basically at risk. For something that we had the discretion to at least attempt to address. We knew it would be an uphill battle. We knew we had to work with it over time, and we did work through those things. But there's still some battles underway, still like with China. But it was the right decision at the time. I have no doubt about that, and I feel like it's made a difference. And I'll let others talk about it.
At the time, and since, I've been disappointed, maybe I'm naive to say this, but that the stock exchange let this happen. No reason in the world, if the objective here was to protect Americans, investors, and if the way to do that is to require inspections of those whose shares are listed in the United States. Issues, that's the issue. I thought the stock exchange should step in and say, you're welcome to stay with us, we'll give you a transition period, but if by such and such a date, you're not subject to either inspection by PCAOB or some comparable organization who makes its reports public and so forth, you can't be listed in the United States. But not to be unfair, but I guess they didn't want to give up the listing standards, listing fees. I'm getting a great chance to unload today. Thank you.
I mean, I guess what strikes me in this area, this may be a little different than what you asked about, Gordon, but how widely the PCAOB has been copied internationally. I mean, when you sort of look at the international picture generally, the idea of an independent audit oversight body with inspection powers has become, I think it's pretty fair to say, sort of the norm worldwide now, whereas that was not the case when Sarbanes-Oxley was passed. Of course, IFER was created as a vehicle for these regulators to work together. I think that's been a positive development overall, and maybe it's helped ease some of the strains in terms of relationships with other regulators on international inspections.
We also had these great meetings, well attended by people from all over the world, as you recall, with the folks coming in to study what we were doing. I thought they were extremely helpful, well staffed by our people, well attended. One of the things that sticks in my mind about them is, I believe without exception, while I was there, the largest delegation year after year was from China. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Okay, well, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. So briefly, I'd like to go around and just, for each of the founding board members, based on your experience, do you have a quick piece of advice or reflection on what the PCAOB should be doing going forward? We'll just maybe take it in turns in the order you first spoke. Please try to keep it to a minute or so we can wrap this up around 1:15.
I'm afraid I really don't have any advice going forward other than just to keep your eye on the ball. I think that what the organization has been doing has demonstrated the value and the of a PCAOB, and just like as Dan was saying, this is it was initially unique, but now has been modeled by other countries. And I think there's a reason for that, and just keep up the good work.
Who's next?
Bill, I think that's you.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that my advice, and I'm sure it's not necessary to say this, is always to keep in mind, particularly when there are close questions, that the objective of this whole activity is to protect investors. And I'm not talking about just big investors that are around today, or the hedge funds or anything like that. I mean, there still are mom and pops out there, small businesses which invest some of their pension funds for their employees. Just same thing with the SEC, same objective, protect investors, and everything else is secondary. Not the firms, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I think I would say keep in mind that public confidence in a regulator is a very fragile thing. It's difficult to build, and it's difficult to maintain. I think I said this already. I think one of the keys to building it and what we did was showing the public that we were open to hearing views from all the different stakeholders that we had, public roundtables, public meetings, standing advisory group, and ended up having 2 standing advisory groups. I think, well, you don't have to follow the advice, but letting people know that they have a chance to have input into the process, particularly people who might be inclined to be your critics, is very important. And I would urge future PCAOBs to follow those traditions.
Charlie, you have the final word.
Okay, well, I think there was an area that I felt like we didn't do as well as I would have liked. I don't know if this is as much telling people today what they should do, because I'm not there. I don't see what they see. But I always worried that we were so focused on, in our inspection process, on technical compliance, that it had the risk of missing the bigger issue. As I mentioned before, I think the bigger issue was less about technical compliance and more about risk that built up in the system that wasn't recognized as risk for a number of reasons. And I think it's important to always reevaluate where you are in your program and to constantly challenge whether or not the program is addressing the real issues, as Bill put it, that affect investors. That's it.
Great. Well, just to wrap up, I want to thank each of you for your contributions here today, as well as for your service on the board. I think as we've shown today, you've left a lasting legacy for sure. And on behalf of all the panelists, I also want to again thank the SEC Historical Society for hosting this panel. Jane, let me turn it back to you to introduce the second panel.
Thanks for leading us through this, Gordon.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Gordon. And thank you, Kayla and Dan and Bill and Charlie. Your thoughts and insights today were very interesting, and appreciate your preparation and time that you put into this program. We'll now go to panel 2. Our moderator for this program, for this particular panel, is Julie Bell Lindsay. Maybe I'll give us a second to have our technician pull up the panelists for panel 2. There's Julie, great. Hi, Julie. So Julie is the Executive Director of the Center for Audit Quality, a position that she's held since May of 2019. Before that, Julie was Managing Director and Deputy Head of Global Regulatory Affairs at Citigroup, a position she began in February 2017. Prior to Citi, Julie served as counsel to Commissioner Cindy Glassman at the SEC, and she's also held roles as counsel and associate at law firms in Washington, D.C. and Palo Alto, California. Julie, thank you for volunteering your time today, and I'll turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you all for joining the second panel on the leadership of the largest audit firms in the early days of the PCAOB. Before I introduce each of the panelists and before we begin our discussion, I want to set the stage a bit. So for nearly 4 decades prior to the signing of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in August of 2002, there had been an evolution towards more regulation of the public company audit profession, which ebbed and flowed over the years, but culminated in the passage of the Act. Enactment of the legislation required public company audit firms to act quickly to prepare for this new regime of oversight and inspections by the PCAOB. This required transformations within each firm's internal culture, within their processes, their systems, as well as changes in each organization's relationships with the public, their clients, the other audit firms, as well as the SEC. Decisions during this transition would be momentous in charting a markedly different course for the profession in pursuit of improved audit quality. And we are very pleased to have with us today those who are at the front lines of this transformation and can share their firsthand experiences. So what I'm going to do is introduce each of the panelists and ask them to each respond briefly to 3 questions. What were your expectations leading up to the passage of the Act? And then what surprised you and what met your expectations? So to start, I'm going to start with Jim Turley, who was at the time chairman and CEO of EY Americas. So Jim, take it away.
Well, thank you, Julie. Look, in the weeks and months leading up to SOX being enacted, we had all been living through what had happened to the Anderson firm at EY, and I suspect at each of the other firms, we had already started scrubbing literally everything that could touch the delivery of audit quality. So that's how we hired people, how we trained them, paid them, assigned them to jobs, our supervision and review processes, our client acceptance and continuance processes, audit methodologies, technology, everything. So we expected the PCAOB to be a real key part of the fundamental change in the audit profession. And we also expected the PCAOB to add a lot of stress for our audit partners and staff. And frankly, we were right on both counts. I guess you've asked about what surprised us. What surprised me was how effective the new regulator was very quickly at watching literally everything we do. I'll tell you a quick story about that. About 3 or 4 months after the PCAOB was formed, I got summoned to DC for a meeting with Bill McDonough, the first chair. Now, I had met Bill several times. I thought we had a good relationship, but I didn't really know anything about why I was being summoned. So I get into his office, a little bit anxious. I sit down and he's got a single sheet of paper on his desk. He turns the piece of paper around, pushes it across the desk, and asks me to read it. It was an article from the Singapore Straits Times, as I remember. It quoted one of our pretty senior global leaders, and I was also the chair and CEO of the global organization. And it quoted one of our senior global leaders saying something sort of negative about the PCAOB. And Bill simply looked at me and asked if I agreed with the quote and whether that was the firm's view. I looked at him and I said, Bill, I'm pretty sure you know I don't agree with that. And the message was really pretty simple, and the meeting was quite good. First, the message was we're always watching everywhere in the world. We have a clipping service, so be careful. And second, get your darn team aligned. And so it was a quick meeting. It was a good meeting. And I think they did a great job.
That's great. Great way to start us off, Jim. Next, I'm going to turn to Bob Kueppers. Bob was a senior technical partner at Deloitte during this time. So Bob, if you would share your reflections on those 3 questions.
Sure. In my mind, the expectations leading up really involved exploring, mostly with the SEC, how we were going to strengthen the self-regulatory system, because at that in early days, that was not in the legislation was not on the front burner at all. And in 6 months' time, literally 6 months and 3 days, we had seen 9/11, Enron, WorldCom, and the indictment of Anderson on March 14th. So that was all very, very rapid. And so confidence was dropping. And then George Bush gave his Wall Street speech and said, give me a bill and I'll sign it. And that's when everything shifted to a clear legislative path. And so all of our efforts shifted to helping to hopefully end up with a piece of legislation that was something that wouldn't destroy the profession, it would strengthen it. And when they came up with the PCAOB as a independent regulator, I was thrilled because other choices would include having the government audit all financial statements of public companies, or there's some other model. I really believe that what surprised me, I guess, was I was the last chairman of the SEC practice section, which was our self-regulatory body, the executive committee there. And so to me, I said, how quickly can we get to Washington and meet this new board? And in fact, they did not have an office. As the AICPA, which is our constituent organization for CPAs, we went to Washington and basically said, I've got the keys here. We'd love to, we're going to hand them over to you, but please tell us how we can help make this improve the profession, audit quality, and help investor confidence. Fortunately, the people you just saw in the last panel were largely in that meeting, and it started on a very constructive footing. And so I was thrilled and surprised, perhaps, that we could actually work with this new board and its staff. And fortunately, we had some crossover from people we already knew at the SEC. So it was time to roll our sleeves up and get to work and see what we could do to help.
And we're going to talk in a bit more detail and just a bit on the transformation from the self-regulatory aspects with the AICPA into the regulated that you referenced. So thank you for mentioning that. Next up, we have Mike Gallagher, who was a practice partner at PwC at the time. Mike?
Thanks, Julie. And I listened to some of the prior panel. It was great. So Jane, thanks for putting this on. And I think this panel will be hopefully equally good in its contributions. So maybe in terms of not as much as surprise, but what's notable to me, and it goes broader than just the PCAOB, but just the legislation in its totality and how well it's held up for almost 20 years. And I think the reason it's held up so well is it's because it dealt with the three legs of the stool. You know, audit committees in terms of disclosing financial experts and having independent members of the audit committee. All of us on the panel have been to plenty of audit committee meetings on either side of Sarbanes-Oxley, and I think we would say that the improvements were obvious in terms of the improvements to the audit committee's effectiveness. Management, having the CEO and the CFO have to certify. So, no longer did you have plausible deniability, which was replaced by mutual accountability. You couldn't have a CEO put all kinds of pressure into the system and the financial reporting folks saying, hey, get me to the number. And then when the proverbial stuff hit the fan, it was like, wow, I rely on the controller for that. So having alignment with that up and down the chain was really important. And then finally, the impact on the audit profession by having a credible independent regulator that set standards, that had a robust inspection program, and we were focused on internal control. So I think all of those things together, and it may seem simple now 20 years later, but it was actually quite brilliant, what was done, almost 20 years ago, and it's held up quite well.
Great, thank you very much. And last but not least is Sam Ranzilla, who was a senior technical partner at KPMG during this time. So Sam, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Julie. I think from my perspective, I would point out three things that in terms of expectations and maybe what aligned and didn't align. And I can't say that when I go down this list that I actually had this figured out, but first was just the integrated audits. I think we saw how difficult that was going to be. We had some history with financial institutions under fiducia to do effectively internal control audits, and I think we came to the conclusion very quickly that that was not going to be good enough in general. The second piece was the acknowledgement that where we were headed, and I'll refer to the comments made by the others as to where we were headed in this, but that just inevitably our relationships with our audit clients and with the audit committees of our audit clients were going to be changed. I had hoped that it would be for the best, and I think it has turned out actually to improve that. But at the time, I didn't know which way it would go, but I knew it was going to be very different than what we had experienced in the past. And then lastly, just the whole complexity around the inspection process, which I know we'll get to, but it was a bit unnerving to think about that inspection process from the perspective of the individual responsible for developing the processes, the playbooks, dealing with the international piece of it. Just a lot of things that I didn't know where it would go, but I at least was smart enough to figure out that this was going to be a very difficult task, and it proved that inspections did take some time to get a rhythm before we, at least at my old firm, before we really started to get a rhythm on how to deal with it properly. So those are my three impressions.
And as you said, Sam, we're going to be coming back to, I think, each of those topics that you mentioned in the course of the discussion. So we're now going to go into kind of the meat of the discussion. And I'm going to ask each of you various questions. But as we discuss, feel free to chime in and have a dialogue going on each of these topics. So Jim, I'm going to come back to you and follow up on something that Bob had mentioned, which is, as the Act was being put together, how did the firms generally react to this concept of independent regulation compared to the longstanding regime of peer review and self-regulation?
Yeah, Julie, it's a really good question. Bob raised it. You actually mentioned it in your opening. What we were really living through was a cultural transformation of the audit practice. And I'd say really a transformation of the entire firm. Right when Enron occurred and then all of these other cascading things that Bob mentioned, in my organization, we were already working on two major other cultural transformations. And one was to have a truly great inclusive leadership culture. Now it's called DEI in the world. And the other was to be a fully globally integrated organization, not 145 separate country-based partnerships. And so, as I look back, like the other two cultural changes we were in the middle of, shifting from self-regulation to independent regulation really required strong, consistent messages repeated over and over and over again to different audiences everywhere. Also, like the other two big changes, I think this required us to proactively think about each partner's degree of effectiveness and how well he or she supported the changes that we were making. We need to think about that as we chose leaders, whether it was in geographies, whether it was industry sectors, service lines. And we really needed to bake that proactive analysis into all of our partner and other evaluations. And so it was a really big change. Now, unlike the inclusion and the global transformation work we were doing, as the first panel talked about, this one wasn't globally consistent at the time. And so each country's regulator was in a different place. That did add complexity to all of this, as many of our clients, and we were trying to work in a fully harmonized way. But it really required changes to the way we looked at ourselves and what we expected of people, and created different positions for different people.
Sam or Bob or Mike, anything to add?
I'm glad that Jim mentioned sort of you get down below the surface and the internal complexity, and trying to explain to, let's say the audit people are half of your firm or some percentage, and then you've got tax people, you have consultants, you have others. It really was high degree of difficulty, and yet nothing could be more important than that. And so you always felt like each day we have to keep moving forward. We have to bring everybody along. And you were constantly sort of reshaping things as you went, because we didn't see another option.
And as I said, you couldn't have someone leading a practice in any part of the country if he or she didn't support the move to an independent regulation regime, because they would be sending messages inconsistent with the messages that I and our other firm-wide leaders were sending. And so we really needed to be very conscious of this.
So the tone at the top that was referred to quite a bit during this time, certainly applied within the individual firms as well. I'm going to move.
It did, but like any culture change, the tone at the top's important. You got to get the echo at the bottom and the permafrost layer in the middle. You needed to look at all of that, or else you weren't going to be effective at this.
It's a great way to put it. Bob, I'm going to come back to you. for the next topic, which is, I don't think there's probably any other profession, there probably is, but certainly with the audit profession, where the actions of one can harm the reputation of the whole bunch. And it is without question that during this time, the reputation of the public company audit profession took a hit. One of the first orders of business for the leaders in the firms was to determine how to regain public's confidence.
Right.
How did you think about this issue at your firm, and how important would you say it was for the firms to all work together on this?
It's a great question, and one that really typifies the effort to align and be much stronger as a profession than individual firms, for sure. One of the things that doesn't get mentioned often is that if you look at March 14th, the indictment of Andersen, those companies, and Andersen audited their fair share, believe me, those companies and audit committees started realizing, I don't know where this is going. How can we reappoint Andersen for 2002? Because we don't know what this indictment is going to mean. And so there was a general shift of clients from Andersen to the other firms. There was a personnel shift. While everything else is happening, there was so much strife over what does this all mean? It was a daily, kind of thing in the press. And as you know, auditors are really not great with the press. That's not our role. We don't seek out attention in that sense. The good news is that the firms, I would say the largest firms, and by that it's certainly the 5 of us, which is now the 4 of us, and used to be the 8 of us, but also our colleagues in the whole next tier. We know each other really well, and because of our relationships at the AICPA and the old practice section, we have a natural group that's used to working together. And it was very clear to many of us that we had to continue that in an even stronger way, because things in Washington, as you know, if there's legislation being discussed, I can't go up and visit on the Hill and then have Mike or Sam or Jim go up with a completely different notion, because you'll get nothing done. We always hear the lesson. If the profession has a view, it's a lot better if you can align on that. And that's exactly what we did. Using our folks in Washington and some of us personally, it was very important to try and speak with a single voice, even though things were in such a state of uncertainty. It also pointed out that the public company auditors are different than the rest of the profession. I just think of CPAs, there's several 100,000, right? But only a very small percent of the membership of the American Institute of CPAs, the AICPA, were people who were actually performing public company audits. So that caused us to say, well, maybe the public company audit profession is a little different than everybody else. And now that this legislation is coming, we're certainly going to be regulated in a different way. So we started thinking about how we could help our image. And one of the outcomes eventually was the formation of the Center for Audit Quality, which you now, of course, lead. And that made a big difference, because it was a place to come together and work on issues for public company audits, which obviously impacts a huge part of our reputation, our risk, and and our business, frankly. So we by working together, I don't know if we'd even be here today if we went our own ways, because it really necessitates collaboration across the firms.
Hey, Julie, one thing I'd add to that is, Bob's being modest. Bob was at the forefront, of putting the CAQ together. I know that because I've been in the Bob Kueppers conference room at the CAQ many times, but he deserves a ton of credit for having that vision and getting it done. And Sam, before me, was the chair of the Professional Practice Executive Committee, where our mission is really to help each other. And by the way, each other includes some of the smaller firms and medium-sized firms that are performing public company audits. Going back to your point, that if one of us fail, all of us bear the consequences. And so it's in all of our interests to support the capital markets through high quality auditing. And, not everybody has got the resources of a Big Four firm. And so making sure we're using that and we're contributing it back to folks that are, auditing in this space that don't have those resources.
Mike, it's a really good point, and Bob was clearly at the center of this. I was honored to be the first chair of the Center for Audit Quality. And one of the things that I thought the profession did exceedingly well was not just including the non-Big Four and the smaller firms in it, and including the AICPA, but including investor voices, audit committee voices, former regulator and whatnot, academic voices. This was really important in the formation to give the CAQ the kind of credibility to be able to speak. And you know, when we first formed, it was, you know, we weren't always hearing what we wanted to hear, but we were hearing what we needed to hear from the other members of the CAQ board. So it was, I was really proud of how the profession pulled together on that.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, and I'll echo the comments about Bob's leadership. No question there. As a profession, we had done a fairly decent job organizing ourselves around dealing with the SEC and the FASB. What was really different here, at least, and of course, Bob explains the first, those 6 months in 2001 and 2002, which just happened to be my first 6 months in the national office. And, you know, I thought, what did I get myself into here? But I think that what was different was we hadn't talked a lot about auditing per se. It was mostly around financial reporting. We met with other organizations like the FEI group, but it was always focused in on financial reporting and issues that the SEC had. I thought, at least the ones I was in on, and I think that was at least for me, that was a challenge, because that had not been a topic that I had collaborated much with my with our peer firms. So that was one of the challenges originally.
Well, you guys are certainly almost a public service announcement for the CAQ. So thank you for that background. And Bob, we still have the Bob Kueppers conference room at the office, even though we're not in the office.
My wife, thank you.
So we've talked about the firms working together in dealing with the public confidence issue. But Mike, I'm going to come to you next. There certainly had to be a lot of low morale and frustration within the firms themselves during this time. So how did you at Gillan deal with the challenge of addressing that kind of morale, training, and otherwise preparing for this new oversight of the PCAOB, both from a regulatory and inspections perspective?
Yeah, Julie, thanks. And I appreciate the point there about what was the environment like. I mean, it's easy to forget, 20 years later, but, maybe bringing us back to what the world was like for anybody in this profession. And, of course, Enron and WorldCom had gone down amidst financial reporting failures, severe financial reporting failures. And if you were in the profession, what really hit very close to home was the demise of Andersen. All of us, from the time we graduated from college, first of all, we were just, couldn't believe we were able to land a job at one of these great firms. And then to progress all the way through partner meant so much in terms of defining who we were and everything that came along with it. Financial prosperity, respect in the community, and you really felt like, you'd made it. And then all of a sudden, an amazing firm with an amazing history, like Andersen, in what seemed like a nanosecond is gone. And their professionals, their partners are financially devastated. And all of us were asking, could that happen to me? Will it happen to me? And on top of that, we were smart enough to realize that if this new regulator was going to be effective, they were going to have to be tough. And am I going to be the example that they're going to use to build their reputation as a tough regulator? That's what you were thinking if you were in the practice. So the mindset was really, we were shaken. There is no question about it. a partner in any of the firms doing anything, you were affected. But if you were a partner that was signing those opinions, that was getting ready to be inspected by a new regulator, you definitely were shaken. So it's in that, spirit that we're trying to train, over 10,000 auditors at PwC and tens of thousands throughout the profession. And of course, you have your in-person detailed foundational training of AS2. And on the prior panel, Don Nicolaisen was quoted as saying this is the biggest change to auditing since the 1930s, and it was. Of course, we knew, what internal controls were, and that depending on the nature of the job, you do different levels of testing of internal controls, but not at the level that AS2 was calling for. And most of the audits done by the firms, there was an element of internal control testing, but the focus was really on substantive testing, detailed accounts balances, and transactions. So this was a massive change, and it was a very prescriptive standard, and we knew we were going to be tested on it. So making sure we got the training right and scaling it across huge practices was quite a challenge. On top of that, you talked earlier about how we work with each other. We absolutely work with each other all the time. Our senior technical people were in constant touch with each other. And by the way, as the prior panel indicated, we were in constant contact with the PCAOB. We knew they had to be successful. It was in our interest for them to be successful, and we wanted to help them do that. So that was a great part of it. But it's funny, I reflect back on the technology because everything was changing real time as different interpretations were happening. And the technology wasn't so great. It was conference calls. We didn't have webcasts. Webcasts weren't prevalent, at that point. So we would have these, it seemed like 3-4 days a week, we'd have conference calls, 10,000 people on an AT&T conference call going through the latest technical developments and how you audit under AS2. And there was a bunch of crazy rumors going around too in terms of what the standard meant. There was this one crazy thing that says you're not allowed to talk to your clients anymore about tough accounting issues. They've got to figure it out on their own. You got to give them a test, and then they'll turn in their paper. If they get it wrong, not only do you give them an F, but you give them a material weakness on top of it. Of course, that was nonsense, but that stuff was running around like wildfire. And so, that was the environment that we're trying to drive, the biggest change in the auditing professions, as Don Nicolaisen said, since the 1930s. So interesting time for sure. And I think Bob wanted to say something about, AS2 was interesting, and you're never going to get it totally right first shot out of the barrel, especially as something as comprehensive as AS2. But AS5 was certainly an improvement. Bob, I know you want to say a few words about that.
So AS2 was actually a very perfectly designed standard. The issue with AS2, however, came in its application and what the expectations of what it is to meet the standard. And after there's a lot of pressure, not from the firms, but from our clients, directly to people in Washington at the PCAOB and at the SEC, saying this internal control thing is just killing us, But over time, there was a decision then to take a look, and AS5 was an excellent outcome. I don't know how else to say it, but to me, the board really stepped up because there was pressure, Washington-type pressure, to maybe take it down even further. And I remember with my colleagues here on the call, spending a lot of time with the board, urging them to move forward with AS5. And I think it was probably their determination to go forward because they believed it was the right standard as a second version against all other pressure. Really proved to us that they had the will to be their own regulator, if you will. I mean, because you come to these crossroads, and they really took the right path, and it really changed things in a positive way. And some of the stuff with AS2 would drive us all crazy, clients included. But I thought the transformation of that into AS5 was one of their defining moments as a board, as an organization.
Sorry about that. I was muted. I think as the last panel alluded, we could probably spend the whole time today on AS2 and AS5, but that's great perspective. I want to, Sam, I want to come to you next and talk about kind of the global impact of what was going on at the time. So Jim alluded to one of the other transformations that was going on at EY was getting all the network firms, part of one global brand. How did you deal through the challenge of providing support for all these changes, given the global network structure of the largest audit firms?
Okay. Well, let me start off by saying the first thing you had to do was to give them some cathartic moments to rag on you for a while, and to have some fairly thick skin. Once they got over that and they felt better about, the gringo from New York calling them up and telling them what they needed to do. I think if you look at maybe the three missions of the PCAOB, they each had some interaction. We needed to, as a U.S. firm, take some leadership with respect to each of those functions. So the first thing we obviously had to deal with was registration. Who needed to be registered? How did that need to occur? If you didn't need to be registered, did it make sense to register anyways? I can't tell you how many small firms we had in places I didn't know existed in this world that said, well, we want to register even though we don't play a significant role. We don't even know who you are. And so you had to sort of walk them through that and provide resources to help them figure out who did need to get to get registered, because it was important from a perspective of our global clients, the true multinationals. On the inspection side, this came a little bit later as opposed to, first day type stuff, but you needed to build some processes around to support them. So they needed to be able to see the playbooks that we used in terms of how do we deal with the PCAOB. And as I recall, a lot of the initial conversations was around who had access to documentation, where that documentation would be made available, whether it could be in the home country or it had to be brought to the US. And so there was a lot of time sorting that piece of it out, even when that was a part of the PCAOB processes that ended up maybe further down the line. And then lastly, on the standard setting side, so the third leg of the PCAOB's mission, maybe just using AS2 as an example is the first thing we had to do was credential people to put on U.S. public company audits as playing a significant role. It was no longer just the audit team's comfort level with their group, their component auditor in Spain, but we put in credentialing processes. Well, you got to be trained. You have to get this much training. You have to have this much experience before you can get on one of these accounts. And that took a fair amount of time. And you might imagine a fair amount of negotiating with each of the member firms of the global organization. And then you had to train them. You had to give them training that made sense. You had to make sure that your lead partners in the US knew what that training was and how they should be interacting. So there was a great deal of sharing, I guess, overall in terms of trying to get them a comfort level. And at the same time, they were just starting to deal with the local regulators who were sprouting around the rest of the world, mirroring what was being done in the US. And at least from my perspective, as I went through that process, I thought, you know what, I'm going to need some help when the young ladies from the Netherlands show up saying, we want to start looking at your work. I'm going to need some help there. So this is a good investment of the US firm's time. And it was a significant investment.
Thanks for that. Jim, I'm going to come to you next and shift gears a little bit. Sam alluded to this at the very beginning of our conversation, but clients, in addition to dealing with internal, the profession as a whole, the global networks, you also have the challenge of preparing clients for a very different regime. How did you think about doing that internally? How did you approach that? And how did the clients react to this new regime?
That's a great question. I used to say that I felt like I went to more audit committee meetings than any other person alive, because I know I went to more than my fellow EY partners. I thought I was doing more than my peers or competitors, but let's just say I was no worse than tied with a few others. I think the only way to approach this with our clients was with just absolute transparency about the impact on the firm, the impact on the profession, about the impact on our services to them directly, what we now had to do for the first time, the impact on costs, and what we could no longer do for them. So we're coming at it from both sides, if you remember that. So all of that we needed to be very transparent about. And then it didn't happen day one, but then after the first inspection reports came out, again, it was just a transparent discussion of what we had learned from the inspections, frankly, where we had fallen short and things we needed to strengthen. By and large, I think that the clients reacted very well during some quite tough discussions about material weaknesses, about significant deficiencies, about restatements. If you remember, in the early days of after SOX was passed and the world began changing, when there was all of this deferred maintenance, I know the first panel referred to it as, but deferred maintenance being done around internal controls, I think as many as 1 in 5 US-based public companies were restating their accounts. So it was a very tough time for audit committees and for clients and for ourselves. But I think by just being real straight with each other, we got through it pretty well.
Julie, I'd say it was a great, right around that time, it was a great example of fundamental economics at work with both the supply and the demand curve both shifting in a way that was not good from a client perspective. The amount of work, almost doubled, arguably doubled, because in the early days of AS2, it wasn't as integrated, whether it was the standard or just, muscle memory in terms of how we were doing audits. We were doing a lot of work, maybe twice as much work, and there just, wasn't enough of us on the planet to accommodate everybody's need at the same price. So that certainly shifted. The amount of work changed and the rate changed because, again, just supply and demand. And if you were a small company, public company, medium-sized public company, and you had some risk issues, you might have some trouble, getting a big four firm, at that point to do your audit, just because of the amount of work that we had with everyone else. And on top of that, you had Anderson go under. Now those resources didn't disappear; they were integrated into the other firms, but it wasn't, it wasn't super smooth, in those, first couple of years. So it was a real shock, I think, to the system from a client perspective in terms of how they negotiated fees. They had all the power, beforehand, and it changed overnight, and they felt it. And I'll speak for my own firm. Maybe it wasn't our finest hour in terms of how we dealt with some of those clients. And, things always have a way of coming back later to haunt you. And it certainly did in some cases.
But Mike, as you were saying, each of our firms was dealing with that. And frankly, we all had to resign just because we didn't have the capacity to serve the needs that you just talked about. We were resigning from either private companies, or which was hard on them, or riskier, smaller public companies. And it was a rough time.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add on those are really good points. The one thing that I remembered was the consternation at our audit clients that they now had another regulator regulating them. So they were while very interested in the whole implementation of AS2 and the fees, which are all great points, one of the things that kept coming up was, so I'm going to have now a PCAOB inspector in here telling me that my deferred taxes are misstated by some amount, or they don't agree with our application of revenue recognition. And I think that was a very difficult process for them to get over. And it didn't turn out that way for the most part, but early days, that I think caused a great deal of consternation with at least the senior management of our audit clients.
Bob, I want to pick up on something that Jim talked about, if you have anything to add to his comments, and that's with respect to the audit committees. And I think, Mike, at the very beginning, you did a great job of summarizing how Sarbanes-Oxley kind of brought in the entire financial reporting ecosystem into this new regime. Jim talked about, engaging with a lot of audit committees from a client perspective, but how would you say that the dynamic shifted besides, I'm sure quite a few more meetings, but with audit committees now that they were specifically tasked with overseeing and hiring the external auditor?
Sure. Before I start, I want to ratify a point that was made earlier. I think Jim Turley was at more audit committees than any man on earth for a while there, because you were always doing client visits and so were the other firms, but it really was a change in your allocation of your schedule for sure. So all of a sudden, audit committees are responsible for the auditor relationship, meaning hire, fire, pay, and we always had decent relationships with audit committees of clients, particularly long-standing ones. But we ended up being sort of the instructor saying, okay, here's how it's going to work now. We are regulated by this new organization. They're going to inspect our work papers. Please understand that you're the one audit committee to determine whether or not we continue next year. You're going to engage us for another round of audits or not. There was a level of discomfort, because I think a lot of audit committees felt like that was more form than substance. Obviously, the audit committees don't have the budget to pay us. The company pays us, but they approve the fees, and also, so there was a bunch of things like that. I do feel, though, over time, as we got the inspection regime up and running, and we could explain any failings we had either on that engagement, because I remember early days we said, are we supposed to tell the audit committee chairman that we're being inspected for their audit from last year? And I think Sam and Mike and we kind of said, I don't know, I think I have to, because if depending on what they find, I hate to go to a client and say, oh, I forgot to tell you, but there's a problem on the audit, a material problem or something. So it just changed everything. We had so many, we had to really watch our communications in the back and forth. And I think the more we explained it and the more we got used to it, the more settled in people became and realized that, okay, this is just the way the world is. And then committees started thinking about, what about their responsibilities in this regime, this new regime? And I know the CAQ and others started really thinking about audit committees and consortiums of people that have a stake in financial reporting coming together. All the fraud efforts that were out there, that were not just the profession talking to itself, but using the NACD and the Institute of Internal Auditors, all under the auspices of the CAQ in many ways, was very, very helpful. So we kind of settled in, but I remember the first few years feeling a little odd. And then we always had this problem of going through our inspection results with companies whose work was not inspected, but it's for the firm. How did your report look compared to the other firms and all this kind of stuff. One of the things that we didn't talk about, and I just want to mention, this whole thing with AS2 and AS5, under the old regime, the more you relied on internal controls of the client, which you'd have to test and get comfortable with, the less sampling or testing you would have to do. So a lot of companies came together by merger and all kinds of things over many, many years. And sometime there was no PCAOB, there was nothing, none of that. I think there was a tendency to just select more items than to, the deferred maintenance came from mergers and all kinds of things where they didn't keep up with the infrastructure. So that's why when AS2 came, it was such a burden because companies were behind and we were auditing around the controls many times, not all the time, but that was something that was acceptable to do before AS2 and AS5 made us take a special look at the effectiveness of ICFR.
Hey, Julie, real quick. The other thing that excuse me, audit committees and management teams were dealing with for the first time was needing to, because of the changes, develop deep account type relationships with firms other than their auditor, because there was a whole array of services that were, independence wise prohibited to be receiving from your audit firm. And so many of the audit committees and management teams had to think through that. Who was going to do some of the systems related work, or the internal audit related work, or the tax related work, or the transaction related work that oftentimes previously had been done by the audit firm? And how are you going to look at the total ratio of audit and audit related fees to non-audit fees? This was like a major transformation for audit committees to think through as well.
A lot of complexities and everything hitting at once as well. Great insights. I want to turn now to focus on the two main regulators during this time. So the SEC, and then we'll talk about obviously. But Mike, I want to come back to you and talk about the SEC. Obviously, the SEC before all of this transpired, but how would you say generally the firm's relationship with the SEC in this new regime?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. As you say, we've always had a good working relationship with the SEC, and it's no mystery. The folks that we primarily deal with are the Office of Chief Accountant and the Division of Corporation Finance, and understandably, many of the folks that lead OCA, the Office of the Chief Accountant, come from the firms, because it's a very technical position, and that's historically where the chief accountants have come from. And at the time of Sarbanes-Oxley, Bob Herdman was the chief accountant for about a year into it. Bob's a great guy, did a great job, and then Don Nicolaisen picked up from there. But to be clear, no one, and I'm not talking about these people individually, I'm talking about the institutions, nobody was covered in glory, with the events leading up to the financial reporting crisis, as opposed to the financial crisis, which was a few years later. We all had to rebuild our credibility, and the SEC needed to rebuild theirs as well. They had major public companies go under, amidst financial reporting standards. And so they were under the gun and were, definitely, under a microscope from a public scrutiny standpoint. So we knew at that point that we certainly were not going to catch any breaks, in terms of issues that were identified, and is there a softer landing that would benefit the broader capital markets. And I can think of a couple of issues. We had, a lease interpretation that was done, by retailers, and everybody, kind of saw it the same way. And that was not the way apparently the SEC saw it. And normally in those sort of situations, you find a way to work it out so you're not restating the world. Jim talked about the level of restatements, at some point, and that was for a whole bunch of reasons. But, is it really helpful to restate, so many companies? Because at that point, you're kind of removing the stigma of a restatement. But we knew we weren't going to catch any breaks. And then the other issue that got a lot of play at that time was the stock option, backdating issue, which also caught a lot of attention and resulted in a lot of restatements. But it was a time where, everybody was under a microscope and we were all being held accountable. Everybody was trying to rebuild their reputation. And fortunately, I think we did, over that period of time. And if you look at the number, using restatements as a guide, you could say, well, we had so many in that period. In one way, that was a good thing in that it showed that, the internal control focus was identifying a lot of issues, the deferred maintenance, things that were in the balance sheets built up over time, whether it was acquisitions that Bob mentioned, I think it was, and other things. But it was deferred maintenance, but we were finding stuff that wasn't found before. And I think it's the collective we. Clients were finding it, we were finding it, and we had to work that through the system. And that plus maybe some tougher regulation in terms of, hey, a restatement's a restatement, materiality's materiality, just take your medicine and do it. We went through that period and we got through the other side, and the other side was, we're in a much better place. We don't have that level of restatements. And I would say financial reporting is as good as it's ever been, or better than it's ever been. And the relationship with our regulators is certainly fantastic. We know we are regulated. We know that what our role is in this ecosystem, but we also know it's our role to support our regulators in their missions in order to support the capital markets.
The only thing I'd add to Mike's comments relative to the SEC was they were very important in the transition from AS2 to AS5 with the writing of guidance, their own guidance for their regulated entities, our audit clients. And I can't tell you how much difference that made once the issuer community had some guidance from the SEC that aligned up very well with the PCAOB standards, and how that sort of changed the dynamic of the discussion around, damn, this is your problem. You're charging us too much. Make this problem, and a third of your fees go away to, okay, I've got skin in this game as well. I understand now what the SEC expects from me, and it was really, really helpful in that transition.
Thanks for that, Sam. And Sam, I'm going to stick with you to shift over from the SEC to the PCAOB. During the standing up of the PCAOB in the first year or so as a regulated entity, we've somewhat talked about this a little bit in the course of the discussion, but generally, how would you describe the profession's relationship with this new regulator, the PCAOB?
A groping relationship. So let me address it at my firm's level, and then as a profession, having and Bob will chime in here and help me out at the profession level. At the firm level, I think there was no question that we wanted a constructive relationship, just as clear as day, and we wanted it to be collaborative. But I don't think that we knew what collaborative meant, and at least for just this guy, I don't think I truly comprehended how sensitive the board and its staff was with respect to the optics that they are not influenced by who they regulate. And I think I might have heard Bill Gradison mention that, or Dan Gelser earlier, and I think that's absolutely on point. I don't think we understood just how deep that concern was. And again, we had dealt with regulators, the SEC, for years, and had a very good relationship with them. And so we tried to, pull that playbook out and see if that would work. And we had to modify. We had to modify the way we went about that. At the profession level, I think it, again, I think it was good. But I think it differed by individual. So, for example, if I remember correctly, Doug Carmichael was the first chief auditor. He didn't have a lot of interest. Bob, you might remember this story. You and I had spent a bunch of time putting together how to write standards, and went and had a meeting with Doug, and we were going on for about 20, 25 minutes. And We then stopped. We woke Doug up and said, I think we got it. I think we understand what our role is here. Thanks for taking this meeting. And so that helped guide us, so we knew what the ground rules were. And then on the inspection side, George Diakon, if I remember correctly, was the first chief of inspections. I think I have that right.
Yeah.
And we had all, at least I had a very good relationship with George in his former role at the SEC. And that was a little more, I felt like there was a little more give and take in that. But so stop the rambling. I thought we wanted to be collaborative. We had a shared goal. We knew we had a shared goal. We knew that our success was dependent on each other at the end of the day. But that first year or so was really a groping process. I'll leave it to others to add.
Yeah. So, Sam, I think those are all fair observations. I think that the extent that it improved over time was a function of sort of picking our spots. And I always felt that one-on-one meetings, just as a constituent, one-on-one meetings with the various board members on standards or anything that was going on. I think when the standing advisory group was formed, there was a much more collaborative environment. And it was great to have companies and auditors and investors and attorneys and all these folks sitting around the same table debating, where the standard project should go. But I found that you had to do some individual meetings, some group meetings, and over time, I think the attitude shifted to the point where I think these guys are really trying to be constructive and inform the board's decisions, not telling them what to do. But sometimes we would say, if you do that, here's one problem you might encounter. And so sometimes it was a good feeling that we couldn't dictate, we could only inform. And staying respectful, and every once in a while, I've been known to crack a joke now and again, so I got to be really careful. But it was something we did a lot of, and we did it together, and that was I think the way to go.
I'm going to. We have just a couple more questions that we wanted to get in before we wrap up. Jim, I'm going to come back to you on the professional judgment point that I know we discussed in the prep for the session, and that is, with the understanding that the auditing profession naturally entails the need for auditors to exercise professional judgment, how did the profession deal with this notion that you have a new regulator that could potentially come in and question or even second guess auditor judgment in this environment?
Julie, it's a great question. I'd say mostly we bought a lot of couches. We hired a bunch of psychiatrists. Look, it was rough, but it wasn't that bad. There were lots and lots of questions from our partners about being second guessed, and second guessed by someone at the PCAOB who, frankly, they thought had less experience than they themselves had, and there was probably some truth in some of that, but some sort of falseness in other views around that. There are also a whole lot of questions around whether the firm would have their backs, would have the partners' backs, or whether the firm would cave if being pushed by the PCAOB. Really tough questions. And then there were also lots of questions, I'd say, from partners and young people about whether this was still the profession that they wanted to spend their career in. And so it actually led in the early days to some very, very serious discussions with the PCAOB board about the talent problem the profession feared that we might face. I remember one very direct discussion on this with, I think Bill McDonough was sitting right across from me at the table, and we were talking about people leaving the profession. And Bill said something like, well, all of your people can't get other jobs. And I looked him straight in the eyes and said, Bill, you're 100% right. They all can't get other jobs. I said, but the best ones can. Do you really want the most complex organizations in the world, the banks, which he used to supervise, and others, being audited by people who simply couldn't find another job. And so we actually, I think, came together, the profession and the PCAOB, and embraced the talent issue and thought through how do we implement what they were required to do by statute, what we needed them to do to provide us sort of independent oversight and inspection, and do so in a way that did not create a talent problem for the profession. Right when Enron happened, and you alluded to it earlier, there was a fear that people would not come into the profession. I think what actually happened is the relevance of the profession was highlighted. If you guys could mute yourselves when you get feedback when you guys are not muted. What was happening is, from university campuses, the relevance of the profession was shown during the Enron era. Sometimes your relevance is shown when things don't go perfectly. And so people saw just how important public company auditing was. And we were actually getting a lot of people wanting to come into the profession. And that was a huge positive. But then they were experiencing this stress through the now new inspection process. And so we all worked together on that. And I think worked through it pretty successfully.
Yeah, I think we did work through that successfully together, because they were definitely mindful of that. They got that feedback from all the firms, and we made it clear to our folks, I'm sure the other firms did as well, that a failed inspection is not a career ender. And the PCAOB, to their credit, their inspection staff was very, very supportive of that. They wanted to know how we thought about that and how we were, rewarding quality and making sure that there was, appropriate, carrot and stick for quality, but also making sure that the messaging to our people was, it's not one strike and you're out, that you have one foot fault on your audit and therefore it's non-compliant and you're not going to have a career. And we actually produced a lot of information for our people that showed the trajectory of people that had a failed inspection and how they moved in the firm, in the years after that proved that out. I think Jim's right. I think they became very aware of that issue, and I think that was important to them as well.
Well, we're kind of already talking about the last question that I wanted to ask, and I was going to direct it to Bob, but I open it up to all of you, which is, the challenges and opportunities the firms faced with the new PCAOB inspections regime. I think, the professional judgment aspect is just one aspect of that, but just generally, Bob, we can start with you. What were the challenges right out of the gate on inspections? And I know there was opportunities, but I know there were challenges too.
I'm searching for opportunity there, but there were challenges, because I remember the first year it was the 4 firms and 4 engagements, the Sweet 16. We all just had a limited number, and we all have different software. And I remember getting ready for these visits. We'd load the work papers on a PC and get ready for the inspectors to come, in our offices and that kind of thing. It really did evolve to be much more manageable. But at first, we didn't know what to expect. And we thought, well, how are they going to review our work papers? They don't even understand necessarily our audit approach. And for Deloitte, at least, we don't use the standards in our steps. We just use, this is the Deloitte way to audit receivables or inventory or whatever. So, they really had to learn each firm, all of whom did it a little bit differently. But you know what? As that gave way to a more regular inspection, and we staffed up to be prepared for their arrival in Cleveland and Miami and Denver or whatever, it kind of settled into a much more manageable routine, if I can say that.
Yeah, I would just add that I remember McDonough saying to me once, as he was characterizing the inspection process, he said, and he used Denver. It's funny, when you said Denver, it flashed back to me. He said, Jim, we just want to believe that we have the right, if through our inspections, that you have a partner in Denver who is a menace to audit quality, was how he put it. We want to be able to point that out. And I said, Bill, if we have a partner in Denver or anywhere who is a menace to audit quality, we'd love to hear it from you or from anywhere else, because we don't want a person who's a menace to quality either. And so we actually aligned on the sort of objective of the inspection processes, I think the profession and the PCAOB, because we're all just trying to get better. And it worked.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left, and I'd like to take the opportunity, just like the first panel did, to have just kind of go around the Zoom, so they say, and have each of you share kind of one key takeaway for our audience, whether it's based on hindsight, experience in the past almost 20 years, what the firms did right, what the PCAOB is doing right, any key takeaway that you would want to share. And I'll go in the same order that I introduced you. So Jim, I'm going to start with you.
All right. So, quickly, I think we've sort of said this. I think the firms did a couple things very well. I think we each scrubbed ourselves. We each embraced change in a very real way. And I think that what the firms did too was, repeat myself, to facilitate the formation of the CAQ, which is now signing your paycheck, Julie, was really, really important and powerful. What could we have done better? I actually think that we could have been louder, clearer earlier on about the importance of global consistency of regulatory views. At the beginning, the world was all over the place. We could have been much clearer about the importance of the PCAOB, not just joining, but creating a leading voice within FER. Global differences don't help investors, and they certainly don't help the firms either.
Bob, I'm going to come to you next.
Okay, I guess when I look back on this entire conversation, including the first panel, you know, when you live it, it has special meaning to you. But at the end, to step back and say, do we as firms perform better quality audits today than we did when Enron and all that stuff happened? And I think unquestionably for me, the answer is yes. I think we have made investments, I mean, cash investments in not only training, but audit approaches and analytics and all kinds of things, next generation audit stuff, I'll call it, that gives us the ability and the will, frankly, to do better audits. And I think that's the only thing that matters, because if the markets are better off with that, then I say kudos to the PCAOB, and thank goodness the firms took it seriously. That's my takeaway.
Mike?
Yeah, I think, you know, we're going through a period of tremendous change. You know, technology is changing everything. And I guess if we keep our eye on the ball in terms of why we exist, you know, we exist to provide confidence in the capital markets, to have a highly liquid, you know, capital markets, which gives us a foundation for an economy. And the role we play is incredibly important. It's going to change pretty dramatically, you know, as, again, through technology, how investors consume information, you know, going through a lot of change, but there's certain fundamentals that won't change. And I'll go back to what I said in the beginning. It's a responsibility of the board, management, and the role we play as auditors to provide confidence that the information, whatever it is, whether it's now ESG information, whether, you know, that's the next thing that, you know, that management provides, that potentially, you know, we're going to have to be associated with. So whatever it is, whatever is important to investors, that's the role that we play. And you're never going to be able to audit quality in. And so we play a really important role, but so does management and so does the board. And as we evolve everything else, making sure we stay true to those fundamentals and, you know, understanding the role of the auditor and what we do to make sure that folks are confident in the capital markets.
Very well said. And Sam, I'm going to come to you.
I think I'll be brief, because I agree with the points that have been made. But the key takeaway is, in my mind, there's no question that the PCAOB, and it's the way in which it has operated over the past 20 years, has helped the firms improve audit quality. I think that's undeniable. And we had, you know, maybe it's, I mean, I struggle to remember those early days. I mean, I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning, but I think maybe in hindsight, that, you know, there were some very difficult times when I wasn't sure which way it was going to go. But I think in the end of the day, that organization has helped us improve audit quality. And the establishment of the CAQ falls right behind that in terms of its ability to help the firms to improve audit quality. And that's, you know, that's our reason for being. So that's how I would that's how I would characterize the key takeaway.
Julie, if I could add one more thing real quickly, you know, on behalf of all of us, you know, thank you for what you're doing at the CAQ and for leading us through this discussion. And thank you to Jane for organizing this. But very importantly, thank you to the men and women who were on the first panel, because they actually made the PCAOB what it has become. And so we owe lots of gratitude to them.
That's great. And that's a great way to conclude our discussion today. And Mike and Bob, Sam and Jim, I want to thank all of you for your time. And with that, Jane, I'm going to turn it back over to you to wrap up today's program.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. You did a fantastic job. The whole panel did great. Thank you, Jim and Sam and Mike and Bob. For your important insights and recollections, and it's really nice to see you all again. I want to thank Gordon and the first panel again. Fantastic job you guys did. I think this is going to be a program we'll greatly appreciate having in the virtual museum. And before I conclude the program, I want to thank the CAQ and its governing member firms, BDO, Crowe, Deloitte, EY, Grant Thornton, KPMG, PwC, and RSM, whose generous support over the years has made this program and the upcoming PCAOB gallery possible. I also want to thank all of our viewers for tuning in. The video recording of this and transcript of this program will be available in the museum in the coming days, and you can find that soon. And for all of you, entrance to the many resources in the museum is free, but we greatly appreciate the financial support of viewers like you so we can keep it that way. So next time you're in the museum, click on the Give Today button and make your support count. Thank you again for joining us. Thank our panelists and moderators again, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks, John Bogley, for your technical help.